The first thing she knew was the smell of smoke, thick and greedy in the back of her throat. Not the friendly scent of pine burning in the hearth, but the acrid stink of ruin. It clung to the raw splintered wood of the door frame she'd been thrown through, and it billowed from the roof where the fire gnawed at the sod and timber that had been her home. Her world, for the second time in a month, was ending in ashes. Lorna scrambled backward on her hands and knees, the frozen mud biting into her bare skin. A bruise was blooming dark on her jaw where his hand had struck her, and her thin cotton nightdress was torn at the shoulder. Behind her, in the hellish orange glow, Jedediah stood in the doorway, his broad shape a black silhouette against the flames he had set. "You see now, Lorna." His voice boomed, thick with whiskey and a righteous fury that was the scariest thing she had ever known. "There is nothing left for you, nothing but me. It is the law of God. A man takes his brother's wife, provides for her." His brother, Samuel. The name was a fresh wound in her heart. He had been gone only 4 weeks, laid to rest in the frozen earth on the little rise behind the cabin, his gentle soul finally giving out after a winter of coughing himself ragged. Jedediah had not waited a day. He had started with words, whispers of duty and scripture, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. Tonight, the words had turned to hands. He had come with a bottle in one hand and a Bible in the other, declaring his intentions to claim what he called his inheritance, her. When she had refused, his piety had shattered into rage. The slap had sent her reeling. He had grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like talons, his breath hot and sour on her face. "You will learn your place, woman. Samuel was too soft on you, spoiled you." It was the memory of Samuel's tired, kind eyes that gave her the strength. She had fought, a wild thing cornered, kicking and scratching until she'd broken free and he had stumbled back against the hearth, knocking the oil lamp to the floor. The flames had leaped up the dry wood walls with a hungry roar. For a moment, they had both stared, stunned. Then, a wicked smile had spread across Jedediah's face. He had let the fire spread, let it erase every trace of his brother, leaving only him. Lorna had fled. She had not even thought to grab a cloak or her shoes. She had just run, the roar of the fire and Jedediah's laughter chasing her into the crushing dark of the prairie night. Now, she ran until her lungs burned and the soles of her feet were numb and raw. The night was a vast, starless black, and the wind was a razor, slicing through her thin nightdress and raising goose flesh on her skin. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to get away. Away from Jedediah, away from the smoldering grave of her life. The world was snow and shadow. Each step was a guess. The ground was uneven, a treacherous mix of icy patches and sharp, frozen clumps of buffalo grass that tore at her feet. She stumbled and fell, again and again, her hands scraping against the frost-covered earth. She would lie there for a moment, the cold seeping into her bones, a terrible, seductive numbness that whispered for her to just stay put, to sleep. But then the image of Jedediah's face, lit by the fire, would flash in her mind, and a fresh wave of terror would wash over her, forcing her back to her feet. She kept her eyes fixed on the memory of the little wooden cross that marked Samuel's grave. It was all she had left of him. They had come west with such hope. 2 years ago, Samuel had been convinced the dry prairie air would heal his weak lungs. He had been a good man, a quiet man, with hands that were better suited for carving small wooden birds than for breaking the stubborn plains sod. He had loved her with a gentle reverence that had made her feel safe, cherished. But his sickness had been a shadow that followed them, darkening their small joys. His family had never approved. They saw her as another mouth to feed, another burden on their ailing son. His mother's voice was a constant, nagging echo in her head. "She is not strong enough for this life. She will be the death of him." When Samuel had finally passed, their thinly veiled dislike had turned to open scorn. They blamed her. They whispered it in the general store, in the churchyard. They said she had worn him out, that her needs had sapped the last of his strength. And Jedediah, he had looked at her not with scorn, but with a possessive hunger that was far worse. Hours bled into a formless agony of cold and exhaustion. The wind picked up, driving needles of snow into her face. Her shivering was constant now, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in her marrow and shook her whole body. She wrapped her arms around herself, but there was no warmth to be found. Her mind began to drift. She saw Samuel's face, pale and smiling, beckoning to her from just ahead. She tried to call his name, but her throat was raw and no sound came out. She was following the curve of a frozen stream, the dark, jagged line of rocks offering the only landmark in the endless white. She did not know how long she'd been walking. The moon was a pale, hidden sliver somewhere behind the thick clouds. Thirst was a fire in her throat. She knelt by the stream, breaking a thin layer of ice with a stone and cupping the frigid water to her lips. It was so cold it hurt her teeth, but it was life. As she tried to stand, her legs gave out completely. She pitched forward, her head hitting the snow-dusted bank with a dull thud. The world went soft and gray at the edges. Just a little rest, she thought. Samuel will wait for me. The darkness took her then, a quiet, peaceful blanket after the noise and the fire and the fear. He found her just after dawn. Eli Cade was riding east, his pack-horse trailing behind, laden with sacks of flour, salt, and beans from a supply run to the distant settlement of Redemption. He was a tall man, quiet by nature and made more so by the solitude of his life. He saw the splash of white against the dark rocks of the stream, a patch of white that did not belong. At first, he thought it was a deer, fallen and caught in the snow. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the fresh powder. The air was still and bitterly cold. As he drew closer, he saw the shape of a woman, curled on her side, her dark hair fanned out against the snow like spilled ink. Her feet were bare, blue and raw. Her nightdress was flimsy, torn, and offered no protection against the elements. She was so still. He thought she was already dead. Eli knelt beside her. He touched his gloved fingers to her neck. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, he felt it. A pulse, faint and thready. But there, a small, stubborn flicker of life in the overwhelming cold. He did not waste time with questions. He saw the bruise on her face, the torn dress, the bare feet. The story was plain enough. Trouble had found her, and she had run from it. With a low grunt, he gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of cold limbs and wet fabric. She did not stir as he lifted her, her head lolling against his shearling-lined coat. He carried her to his horse, maneuvering her limp body so she was seated in front of him, her back resting against his chest. He unwrapped the woolen blanket from his bedroll and draped it around her, tucking it in as tightly as he could. Then he mounted up behind her, holding her securely with one arm, and urged his horse into a steady walk. His own cabin was the closest shelter, a half-day's ride west. It was her only chance. Lorna surfaced slowly, floating up from a deep, dreamless black. The first thing she felt was warmth, a heavy, penetrating warmth that seemed to be coming from all directions. The second thing she smelled was coffee and wood smoke. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were heavy, glued shut. A low moan escaped her lips. A presence shifted beside her. A hand, calloused and warm, touched her forehead. It was gentle. She flinched, a tremor of fear running through her. "Easy now," a low voice said. It was calm, steady, not Jedediah's voice. She forced her eyes open. The light was dim, golden. She was lying on a pallet of blankets and furs in front of a large stone fireplace. A cheerful fire crackled and spit, throwing dancing shadows across the rough-hewn log walls of a small cabin. She was wearing a man's flannel shirt, thick and soft, that dwarfed her frame, its sleeves rolled up a dozen times to free her hands. The scent of pine and soap and man clung to it. The heavy warmth was coming from the fire and from the thick wool blankets piled on top of her. A man was kneeling beside her, a tin cup of steaming liquid in his hand. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the seams of his shirt. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines around his eyes and mouth. His hair was the color of dark earth, and his eyes, as he looked at her, were a clear, startling gray. They held no pity, no judgment, only a quiet, watchful intensity. This was the man who had found her, Eli Cade. "Drink this," he said, his voice a low rumble. He helped her sit up, his arm strong and steady behind her back. The simple movement sent a wave of dizziness through her, and her whole body ached with a profound, bone-deep soreness. She took the cup. It was broth, rich and salty. She drank it slowly, the hot liquid a balm to her frozen insides. When she was done, she handed the cup back, her hand shaking. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a hoarse crackle. She looked down at herself, at the unfamiliar shirt, the pile of blankets. Her own nightdress was gone. A hot flush of shame crept up her neck. He seemed to understand. "Your clothes were wet and frozen," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "They are washed, hanging to dry." She pulled the blanket tighter around her. I have to leave." She tried to push herself up, to swing her legs off the pallet, but a sharp, shooting pain from her feet made her gasp and fall back. "Your feet are frozen bad," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "You are not walking anywhere for a while." "I cannot stay here," she insisted, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "It is not right. I will be a burden. I must go." He looked at her then, his gray eyes meeting hers. "Where will you go?" he asked simply. The question stopped her. Where would she go? Back to the burned cabin, back to Jedediah. The thought sent a cold spike of fear through her. She had nowhere, no one. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and shameful. She turned her face away, toward the fire, so he would not see. He did not press her. He simply stood up, took the empty cup, and went to the other side of the small, one-room cabin. "Rest," he said, his back to her. "That is all you need to do right now." The next few days passed in a slow, quiet haze. Eli Cade was a man of few words, but his actions were a language of their own. He tended to her with a stoic, almost detached patience. He would clean and bandage her blistered feet, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such large, rough hands. He never winced at the state of them, just worked with a quiet efficiency that was more comforting than any words of sympathy could have been. He kept the fire blazing, cooked simple, nourishing meals of stew and cornbread, and made sure she always had a hot cup of broth or weak tea beside her. He never asked her name. He never asked what had happened, or why a woman was wandering the prairie in the dead of winter in her nightclothes. His silence was a gift. It gave her space to breathe, to let the raw edges of her terror begin to soften. It was a stark contrast to the prying questions and knowing glances she had endured from Samuel's family. Eli Cade asked for nothing. He simply gave her shelter and left her to heal in the quiet cocoon of his cabin. During the long hours while he was outside, tending to his horses or chopping wood, Lorna's mind would drift back. She remembered her wedding day, Samuel, so handsome and frail in his Sunday suit, his hand trembling slightly as he slipped the thin gold band on her finger. He had been so kind, reading to her in the evenings, bringing her wildflowers he found by the creek. He had never been strong, and the hard life of a homesteader had worn him down faster than either of them had wanted to admit. As he grew weaker, Jedediah's presence had grown larger. He would come over to help, his eyes always finding her, making her feel exposed. He would stand too close when he showed her how to mend a fence, his knuckles brushing hers. Samuel, lost in his own fog of illness, had not seemed to notice, or perhaps he had, and had been too weak to stop it. The helplessness she had seen in his eyes in those final weeks was a memory that haunted her. He had known he was leaving her vulnerable, and it had broken his heart. Her mother-in-law, Martha, had made her own feelings plain. "He needs a strong wife, not a delicate flower," she would say, her lips pursed in disapproval. "He spends his strength worrying over you." The words were like stones, and Lorna had no shield against them. After Samuel's death, they had become a chorus, a constant reminder of her failure. "You are a burden. You are alone. You are nothing without a man to protect you." Now, lying in another man's cabin, wearing his shirt, eating his food, those voices were louder than ever. Shame was a heavy cloak. Each time Eli brought her a plate of food, she felt a fresh wave of it. She was a beggar, a stray he had taken in. She had to repay him, to prove she was not useless. On the third day, she felt strong enough to sit up for more than a few minutes at a time. While he was out, she found his sewing kit in a small wooden box. Several of his shirts lay folded on a stool, missing buttons or with small tears at the seams. Her fingers, still clumsy from the cold, fumbled with the needle and thread. But she persisted. She stitched on a button, her stitches small and even. She mended a tear in a cuff. It was a small thing, but it felt like a monumental victory. It was work. It was useful. When he came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, he saw the mended shirts. He stopped, looking at them, then at her. She braced herself, expecting him to be angry at her for touching his things. But he just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, and took one of the shirts to hang on a peg. He did not say a word, but in that moment, something shifted between them. He had seen her effort, and he had accepted it. She grew stronger. She started to move around the cabin, limping heavily on her bandaged feet. She swept the floor with a handmade broom. She washed the few dishes they used. She kept the fire fed. She was grasping at any scrap of dignity she could find, trying to build a wall against the shame that threatened to drown her. Eli let her. He would come in from the cold to find the cabin tidier, a pot of coffee warming on the hearth. He never commented, but he would leave a piece of firewood just inside the door, where it was easier for her to reach. They moved around each other in a quiet, unspoken rhythm, two solitary people sharing a small space, their pasts hanging silent and heavy in the air between them. One night, the wind howled outside, rattling the single window pane and sending drafts through the chinks in the logs. Lorna was already on her pallet by the fire, pretending to be asleep. She heard Eli moving around, the soft clink of the tin basin, the slosh of water being poured. He was usually already in his bunk, a simple bed built into the far wall, by the time she lay down for the night. Curiosity got the better of her. She cracked open her eyes just a slit. He was standing in front of the hearth, stripped to the waist. The firelight played over the hard muscles of his chest and arms. He was washing, his movements quick and efficient. As he turned to sluice water over his shoulders, she saw his back. Lorna's breath caught in her throat. His back was a roadmap of old pain. Thick, ropey scars crisscrossed the skin, pale and white against his tanned flesh. They were not the jagged, random marks of a fight or an accident. They were parallel, deliberate, the kind of scars left by a whip. They started at his shoulders and ran all the way down to his waist, a testament to some old, brutal history she could not begin to imagine. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart pounding. She had been so consumed by her own fear, her own pain, that she had seen him only as a rescuer, a stoic, unreadable figure. But those scars told a different story. They spoke of suffering, of a past that had marked him as deeply as hers had marked her. This quiet, solitary cowboy, this gentle man who had saved her from the snow, had his own ghosts. And in that moment, lying in the warm glow of his fire, wrapped in his shirt, she felt a strange and unexpected kinship with him. She was no longer just the rescued, and he was no longer just the savior. They were two strangers, huddled together against the cold, each bearing scars that no one else could see. The image of Eli's scarred back stayed with Lorna long after she had feigned sleep, a secret she held in the quiet dark. It was a visible history of pain, a story written on his skin that he chose not to speak. It made the cabin feel different, smaller. Her own shame, which had felt like the largest thing in the world, now had to make room for the silent weight of his. This new awareness brought with it a fresh and terrible wave of impropriety. She was a woman, a widow, under the roof of an unmarried man. It was one thing when she was half dead and helpless, a matter of Christian charity. But now she was walking, mending his shirts, sharing the small space with him from dawn until dusk. The next morning, she could not meet his eyes as he ladled stew into a bowl for her. She stood rigidly by the door, her hands clenched at her sides. "I cannot sleep by the fire anymore," she said, her voice tight and thin. Eli paused, the ladle hovering over the pot. He looked at her, his gray eyes patient, waiting. "I will sleep in the barn," she continued, the words rushing out. "It is not right, me being in here. I am well enough now. The hay is warm. I will be fine." He set the ladle down and looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She felt a hot blush creep up her neck, certain he was judging her, thinking her ungrateful. He had saved her life, and here she was making demands, speaking of propriety when she had been found half-naked in a snowdrift. "No," he said, the words simple and final. "But people will talk," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "If anyone finds out, my reputation, what is left of it, will be ruined. A woman does not sleep in a man's cabin." "There are 2 horses and a milk cow in that barn," he replied, his tone as practical as if he were discussing the weather. "It is cold enough to freeze a well solid. You will sleep in here." "Then I must leave," she whispered, the old, desperate solution rising to her lips. "I must—" He walked over to the corner of the cabin where he kept his tools and a stack of unused lumber. He picked up a saw and a hammer. He did not look at her as he spoke. "It is warmer here, that is all." He spent the rest of the morning working in the small space between the hearth and the wall. He was methodical, his movements economical and precise. He sawed planks of pine, the clean scent filling the cabin. He hammered them together, the rhythmic sounds echoing in the quiet room. He took a spare canvas sheet and stretched it taut across the frame, securing it with small nails. By midday, he had built a simple but sturdy cot. He placed it in the corner, layered it with 2 thick wool blankets and a flattened pillow stuffed with chicken feathers. He stood back and looked at his work. Then he turned to her. "This is your bed now," he said. He picked up his bowl of stew, which had gone cold, and sat at the small table to eat. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. Lorna stood frozen, watching him. He had not argued with her about reputation or what was right. He had not tried to soothe her fears with words. He had simply solved the problem in the most practical way he knew how, building her a space that was hers and hers alone, within the shelter of his walls. He had heard her fear and answered it not with logic, but with labor. Tears pricked her eyes, and she turned away quickly before he could see. That night, she lay on the cot, tucked tightly under the blankets, and for the first time since Samuel's death, she felt a flicker of something that resembled safety. Trouble, however, had a way of finding its way even to the most isolated corners of the world. A few days later, a grizzled trapper named Silas stopped by on his way down from the mountains, his mule laden with pelts. Eli gave him a cup of coffee and a piece of cornbread, a common courtesy in a land where neighbors were few and far between. Silas's eyes, small and bright like a weasel's, kept darting over to Lorna, who was pretending to be absorbed in mending a tear in a grain sack. Silas did not stay long, but as he left, he gave Eli a sly, knowing grin. Keeping warm this winter? Cade, he said, his voice greasy with insinuation. I see that. Eli's face hardened, but he said nothing. Just watched the trapper until he was a small dot on the horizon. When he came back inside, the air in the cabin was thick with a new tension. Lorna's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the needle. He will tell everyone in redemption, she said, her voice a choked whisper. They will all know. They will say I am your woman. The word felt foul in her mouth. Let them talk, Eli said, his voice rough with dismissal. The words of a fool like Silas mean nothing. They mean everything, she cried, jumping to her feet. You do not understand. For a woman, a reputation is all she has. Once it is gone, she is nothing, less than nothing. They will call me a whore. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Eli looked at her, his jaw tight. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in her eyes, and he knew this was a fear deeper than just idle gossip. This was a wound that had been struck before. The memory rose in her then, vivid and suffocating. It was from the summer before, when Samuel's cough was getting worse, and he spent most of his days resting inside. Jedediah was over, as he often was, to fix a broken axle on their wagon. Lorna brought him a dipper of water. As she handed it to him, his fingers deliberately brushed against hers, lingering for a moment too long. You must be lonely, Lorna, he had murmured, his voice low, his eyes roaming over her body in a way that made her feel ill. A woman like you needs a strong man to look after her. She had pulled her hand back as if burned. My husband is inside, she had said, her voice cold. He is all the man I need. She had turned and walked away, her back rigid. Later that evening, she overheard him talking to his mother, Martha, their voices carrying from the porch. She looks at me, Ma, Jedediah was saying, his tone full of false piety. She looks for me. It is not right. With Samuel so sick, I think she is trying to tempt me. I am a godly man, but I am only human. Lorna had frozen, her blood turning to ice. She waited for Martha to defend her, to scold her son for such a wicked lie, but Martha's voice, when it came, was laced with a venomous satisfaction. I knew it, Martha had hissed. I knew she was a bad seed, wearing that poor boy out, and now she sets her sights on you. She has no shame. She is the reason Samuel is not getting better. She drains the life from him with her wanting. Lorna had stood there, hidden by the doorway. As they convicted and sentenced her, they had taken her rejection and twisted it into a weapon against her. From that day on, their whispers followed her everywhere. They blamed her for Samuel's failing health. They accused her of being a temptress, a loose woman who was driving a wedge between two brothers. When Samuel finally died, their accusations became fact in the eyes of their small community. She was the widow who had killed her husband with her wicked needs. The gossip had become a cage, and Jedediah held the key. Now, in Eli's cabin, that same cage was closing in around her again. I have to go, she said, the words a familiar, panicked refrain. I am bringing you nothing but trouble. I will not have them saying such things about you. I will not be the cause of your ruin, too. She started for the door, her limp more pronounced in her haste. Eli moved to block her path, not by touching her, but by simply standing in her way. He was a solid, immovable presence. I told you, he said, his voice low and steady. You are not leaving. You do not want me here, she sobbed, the tears finally breaking free. I am a burden, a disgrace. He was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. When he finally spoke, his question was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Do you even want to go? She stared at him, stunned into silence. No one had ever asked her that. Not Samuel, not his family, not Jedediah. Her life had been a series of duties and obligations, of things she had to do. What she wanted had never been part of the equation. Did she want to go? Did she want to walk back out into the brutal cold? With no destination and no hope, did she want to face the possibility of running into Jedediah again? No. The truth was a terrifying, undeniable thing. She did not want to leave. She wanted to stay here, in this quiet cabin, with this quiet, scarred man who built her a bed and stood between her and the door. But she could not say it. To admit it felt like a betrayal of Samuel, of her own shame, of everything she was supposed to be. She could not answer. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, and shook her head, a gesture of helpless confusion. As if on cue, the wind outside picked up, shrieking around the corners of the cabin. The sky, which had been a clear, cold gray, was darkening with an ominous speed. Fine. Hard pellets of snow began to rattle against the window pane. Eli glanced at the window. "Looks like the decision has been made for now," he said grimly. "A blizzard is coming. We are not going anywhere for a few days." The storm descended upon them with a furious, white violence. The world outside disappeared, erased by a swirling curtain of snow. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the small cabin felt like a tiny, fragile ship in a vast, roaring sea. For 3 days, they were trapped, the cabin their entire world. The endless expanse of the prairie was gone, replaced by the intimacy of the small, fire-lit room. The forced proximity should have been unbearable, but strangely, it was not. The storm outside created a stillness inside. They fell into a comfortable, domestic rhythm. She would cook while he repaired a piece of tack. He would read from a worn copy of an almanac while she patched a hole in one of his blankets. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the roar of the wind, the crackle of the fire, and 1,000 unspoken things. On the 3rd evening of the storm, the wind finally began to die down. The cabin was warm and quiet, the fire burning low. Eli was sitting at the table, a small, leather-bound book in his hands. Lorna was on her cot, her mending in her lap, though she had not put a stitch in it for the last hour. Eli opened the book. "My sister, Clara, she used to write things down," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "She was supposed to be a schoolteacher." He began to read. His voice was not polished, but it was steady and clear. The words he read were simple. Observations of a life lived quietly. October 10th. The aspens on the far ridge have all turned to gold. It looks as if the sun has spilled all over the mountain. I wish I could paint it, to keep that color for the gray days in January. Papa says there is no time for such foolishness, but I think God would not have made such beauty if he did not want us to look at it. November 3rd. A hawk took one of the chickens today. Mama cried. I know it is a loss of an egg layer, but I felt sorry for the hawk. It must be a hard thing to have to kill to live. Lorna listened, her hands still in her lap. The words of this girl she had never known, this Clara, were like a key turning a lock deep inside her, a longing for beauty, a quiet sorrow for the harshness of the world. She understood. Eli continued reading, his voice a low murmur in the quiet room. He read about Clara's hope of one day seeing the ocean, about her frustration with the endless, repetitive chores of a farm girl's life, about her secret fear that she would grow old and die in this small valley without ever having truly lived. When he finally fell silent, the only sound was the soft hiss of the fire. Lorna had not realized she was crying until a tear splashed onto the back of her hand. Then another and another. A great, silent grief was welling up inside her. For Clara, for Samuel, for herself. She died of a fever the winter before I left home, Eli said, his eyes still on the journal. She was 17. I am sorry, Lorna whispered. He closed the book and looked at her, his face full of a sorrow he rarely showed. She never got to see the ocean. Seeing his pain gave her the courage to speak her own. The words came out in a torrent, a confession whispered in the dim firelight. They blamed me, she started, her voice thick with tears. For Samuel, His mother said I wore him out. His brother, Jedediah, he lied. He said I tempted him. But I did not. I swear I did not. He scared me. But no one believed me. They all took his side." She told him everything. About Jedediah's lingering touches, his sanctimonious whispers, about the helplessness in Samuel's eyes as he grew too weak to protect her, about the fire, and the way Jedediah had smiled as their home burned. "He said I was his inheritance," she choked out, the shame of it burning her throat. "Like a piece of land or a horse. And the worst part is, I feel like he was right. I feel ruined, soiled, like my own body is not my own anymore. Like it is just a source of trouble, something that men want to own, or to blame." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the room. "I feel broken." Eli listened. He did not interrupt, did not ask questions. He just sat there, his hands resting on his sister's journal, and let her pour out all the poison that had been festering inside her for so long. His quiet, steady presence was an anchor in her storm of grief and shame. When she was finally spent, her words trailing off into ragged sobs, he got up from the table and came to kneel in front of her cot. He did not touch her. He just looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers, and they were filled with a fierce, unwavering certainty. "You are not broken," he said, his voice low and firm. "You are not." It was not a word of comfort. It was a statement of fact. And hearing it from him, from this man who bore his own brutal history on his back, Lorna felt the first tiny crack appear in the wall of shame she had built around her heart. He believed her, and in the shattered landscape of her life, that belief was a seed. That night, she dreamed. She was not running. For once, she was lying by the fire, just as she had been that first night. But she was not cold. She was warm, safe, in the dream. Eli was lying beside her, his back to her, the firelight tracing the map of scars. He was not touching her, but the heat from his body was a solid, comforting presence behind her. In her dream, she reached out a hand, her fingers hovering just an inch from his scarred skin, wanting to touch him, wanting to understand. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, the ghost of his warmth still clinging to her. The feeling was terrifying, and it was the first thing she had truly wanted in a very long time. The thaw came not all at once, but in a slow, steady surrender. It began as a sound, the soft drip, drip, drip of melting snow from the cabin eaves, a gentle percussion that replaced the howling of the winter wind. Then came the smell, a rich, loamy scent of damp earth waking from its long sleep. The sun, a stranger for so many months, began to linger longer in the afternoons, its light slanting through the cabin's single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. With the changing of the season, Lorna changed too. The gaunt, haunted look in her eyes was replaced by a quiet watchfulness. Color returned to her cheeks, a healthy blush brought on by work and wholesome food. Her feet, though still tender and laced with faint white scars, had healed. She moved with a newfound purpose, her limp all but gone, her dark hair, which had been brutally chopped by her own hand in a fit of grief and rage after Samuel's death, had grown out enough to soften the sharp angles of her face. She had found an old, cracked piece of mirror in a box of Eli's discarded things and had begun to brush her hair each morning. A small ritual of self-possession that felt like a quiet rebellion. The cabin itself seemed to breathe easier, under her care. The small space had transformed. It was cleaner. The floorboards swept. The surfaces wiped clean of the bachelor's dust. A jar on the small table held the first hardy shoots of green she had found poking through the snow near the stream. The air was warmer, filled not just with the heat from the fire, but with the scent of baking bread and brewing coffee. It had ceased to feel like a temporary refuge, a borrowed space. Slowly, imperceptibly, it had begun to feel like a home. Eli noticed the changes, though he said little. He noticed the way the cabin felt when he walked in from the cold, the way his mended shirts were neatly folded, the way she hummed a tuneless song to herself as she kneaded dough. He found himself watching her more often, the curve of her neck as she bent over her sewing, the way she would bite her lip in concentration. A quiet, unfamiliar tension had woven itself into the fabric of their days. They were no longer just a rescuer and a victim. They were a man and a woman, living in a space that had grown too small to contain all the things they were not saying. The breaking point came on an ordinary evening. Lorna was serving the stew, and as she passed him his plate, the back of her hand brushed against his. It was the briefest of contacts, skin against skin, lasting no more than a second. But a jolt went through them both, sharp and sudden, like a spark from a flint. Lorna snatched her hand back as if she had been burned, her cheeks flushing a deep crimson. A muscle jumped in Eli's jaw, and he clenched his fist on the table. Neither of them spoke. The silence in the cabin suddenly roared, filled with the shock of that small, accidental touch. For the rest of the meal, they avoided each other's eyes, the air between them thick with a volatile, new awareness. The fragile peace of their platonic existence had been shattered. In its place was something raw, dangerous, and undeniably alive. After that night, Lorna became consumed by a secret project. Tucked away at the bottom of his laundry pile was an old flannel shirt. It was more worn than the others, faded to a soft gray blue across the shoulders where the sun had beaten down on it, and worn thin at the elbows. It was beyond simple repair, full of small rips and frays. Anyone else would have used it for rags. But to Lorna, it was something more. It was the first shirt he had given her, the one she had woken up in. It still carried the faint, intimate scent of him. When he was out of the cabin, she would take the shirt and work on it, her fingers flying with a frantic energy. She did not just patch the holes, she rewove the fabric with painstaking care, using thread she had salvaged from an old blanket. It was a foolish, sentimental act, and she knew it, but it felt necessary. Mending this shirt felt like mending something broken inside herself. It was an act of care, a way to give back something to the man who had given her everything. And as she worked, a dangerous, desperate idea began to take root in her mind. A few nights later, a full moon rose, bathing the landscape in a cold, silver light. Eli was outside, the sharp, rhythmic ring of his axe splitting the night air as he chopped wood for the morning fire. Lorna watched him from the window, his broad back and strong arms moving with an easy, powerful grace. The longing that she had been fighting for weeks rose in her, a painful, aching tide. It was a longing not just for a man's touch, but for acceptance, for a sign that she was not as ruined as she felt, her heart pounding with a terrifying resolve. She took the mended shirt from its hiding place. She stripped off her own plain dress and chemise. For a moment, she stood in the moonlight filtering through the window, her body pale and vulnerable. The voices of Martha and Jedediah whispered in her ear, calling her wicked, shameless. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing them out. Then she pulled Eli's shirt on over her bare skin. It fell to her mid-thighs, the sleeves so long she had to roll them up again and again. It enveloped her, the soft, worn flannel a phantom embrace. It smelled of him, of wood smoke, sweat, and the clean prairie wind. It was the most intimate thing she had ever done. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she opened the cabin door and stepped outside. The frozen ground was cold beneath her bare feet, but she barely felt it. She walked toward him, a small, trembling figure wrapped in his shirt, her hair a dark cloud in the moonlight. He stopped chopping when he heard her footsteps. He turned, the axe held loosely in his hand, his body tensing as he saw her. He stared, his face a mask of shock and confusion, his eyes taking in the sight of her, wearing his shirt and nothing else, her expression a mixture of terror and desperate hope. The plumes of his breath hung white in the cold air. She stopped a few feet from him, wrapping her arms around herself. Her voice, when it came, was a bare whisper, nearly lost in the vast silence of the night. "Would you still want me?" she asked, her voice breaking on the last word. "Like this?" The question hung between them, fragile and immense. Like this, broken, shamed, a widow who had brought nothing but trouble to his door, a woman who felt she had nothing left to offer. For a long moment, the only sound was the sigh of the wind through the pines. Eli did not move. He just looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a storm of emotions she could not name. Then, with a soft thud, he let the axe drop from his hand. It fell to the ground, forgotten. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. His thumb stroked the line of her jaw, a touch so tender it made her want to weep. "Lorna," he breathed, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving for years, a kiss of desperation and profound, aching need. It was slow but searing, a brand of heat and possession against her lips. All the unspoken tension, all the longing and fear that had simmered between them for months, finally erupted. She gasped, her hands coming up to grip his arms, holding on as if she were drowning. He deepened the kiss, one hand moving to the small of her back, pulling her flush against his hard body, the other tangling in her hair. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. He looked into her eyes, and the stoic mask was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded hunger that made her tremble. Without a word, he bent and swept her into his arms. She gave a small cry of surprise, her arms instinctively wrapping around his neck. He carried her back to the cabin as if she weighed nothing, his strides long and sure. He kicked the door shut behind them, plunging the room into the warm, flickering light of the fire. He laid her gently on the thick fur rug in front of the hearth. He knelt over her, his body caging hers, and began to unbutton the shirt he was wearing. His shirt, as he slowly peeled the fabric away, exposing her skin to the firelight. She began to weep, not from fear, but from a great, shuddering sense of release. All the pain, all the shame, all the lonely nights and terrified days. It was all pouring out of her in silent, hot tears. He paused, his hands hovering over her. "I will stop," he said, his voice thick. "No," she whispered, her hand coming up to touch his face. "Please do not stop." His touch was reverence. He undressed her slowly, his gaze worshipful, as if he were uncovering something precious. He kissed the tears from her cheeks, his lips gentle. He murmured her name, over and over, a prayer in the quiet room. Their lovemaking was not a frantic, hurried thing. It was slow, tender, a deliberate act of healing, but it was marked with a fierce, raw passion, a desperation born of long denial. He was showing her, with his hands, with his mouth, with his body, that she was not broken, that she was wanted, that she was beautiful. For Lorna, it was a homecoming to a body she had thought was lost to her forever. Afterwards, they lay tangled together on the rug, the fire casting a warm glow over their skin. She was nestled against his side, his arm wrapped securely around her, his hand stroking her hair. The cabin was quiet again, the only sound the soft crackle of the embers. A single, lingering fear remained. She tilted her head back to look at him, at his strong profile in the firelight. "I am scared you will regret this in the morning," she whispered, the old shame trying to reclaim its hold. He turned his head, his gray eyes soft and serious. He leaned down and kissed her softly. Then he gathered her even closer, his embrace a solid, reassuring anchor. "Lorna," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear, I never even wanted anything, till you." The simple, profound truth of his words washed away the last of her fear. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she fell asleep in perfect peace. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee. She was in his bunk, tucked under the heavy blankets, and she was alone. For a panicked moment, she thought she had dreamed it all. But then she saw her dress, neatly folded on the chair beside the bed, and on his small, rough-hewn nightstand, next to a worn, leather-bound book, was one of her old hair ribbons, a simple strip of blue fabric she thought she had lost. He had found it, and he had kept it. A quiet smile touched her lips. She dressed and went out into the main room. He was at the hearth, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He turned and saw her, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face, a smile that transformed his rugged features and made her heart ache. He handed her a cup. Their fingers brushed, and this time, neither of them pulled away. The morning sun was streaming through the window. The world felt new and full of promise. It felt like a beginning. And then came a loud, authoritative knock on the door. The sound was a violation, shattering the peaceful intimacy of the cabin. They both froze, looking at each other, the smiles fading from their faces. Eli's expression hardened. He moved to the door, Lorna a half step behind him. He pulled the door open. A man stood on the threshold, a silver star pinned to his thick wool coat. It was the sheriff from Redemption. He was a big man, with a stern face and weary eyes. He looked from Eli to Lorna, his gaze lingering on her with a hint of disapproval. "Cade," the sheriff said, his voice a low growl. "I am here on official business. A complaint has been filed about the woman you have been keeping out here on your land." The sheriff's words hung in the cold morning air, heavy and suffocating. Keeping a woman. The phrase was designed to strip away all dignity, to reduce Lorna to a possession, a scandal. She felt herself shrink back behind Eli, the fragile warmth of the morning, of his smile, turning to ice in her veins. Eli did not move. He seemed to grow taller, broader, a solid wall of defiance against the intrusion. "She is a guest in my home. Sheriff Miller," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She was in trouble. I took her in." "Trouble seems to follow her," Sheriff Miller grunted, his eyes flicking to Lorna again. "A complaint was filed by a concerned party. Jedediah Stone says his sister-in-law ran off after setting fire to her own homestead. Says he is worried for her safety and her virtue." Lorna's blood ran cold. Jedediah. Of course, he was twisting the story, painting himself as the concerned family man and her as the unstable, wanton woman. It was a lie so venomous, so perfectly crafted to ruin her, that she could not even find the breath to deny it. "Jedediah Stone is a liar," Eli stated, the words flat and hard as granite. "And what happens on my land is my business." The sheriff sighed, a weary sound. He was a man caught between the law and the petty cruelties of the people he was paid to protect. "Look, Cade, I am not here to cause a fuss. I am just telling you how it is. The town is talking. A widow, living out here with you, miles from anyone. It does not look right. People are saying you have taken advantage of her grief, for her own good, and for yours. It would be better for everyone if she moved on. Find her a place with a family in town, or send her back to her people." "Her people tried to kill her," Eli said, his hand moving to rest almost casually on the butt of the pistol at his hip. The sheriff's eyes followed the movement. He held up a hand. "This is just a warning. Cade, keep things quiet. Do not give folks a reason to talk more than they already are." He tipped his hat, a gesture devoid of any real respect, turned, and mounted his horse. "I will tell Stone she is safe. For now." They watched him ride away, a black figure shrinking against the vast white and brown landscape. When he was gone, Eli closed the door, and the silence he left behind was 100 times heavier than before. The hope that had bloomed between them only an hour ago was a trampled, bruised thing. Lorna sank onto a stool, her hands trembling in her lap. "He will not stop," she whispered. "Jedediah, he will keep coming until he has ruined me completely." Eli came to stand in front of her. He looked down at her, his face grim, the lines around his eyes etched deep with a cold anger. "I will not let him touch you." "But what about the town? The sheriff? They believe him. They will always believe him over me." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "I have brought this shame to your door. Eli, I knew I would." He knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. His grip was strong, steadying. "Then we will give them something else to talk about," he said, his voice low and intense. "Marry me, Lorna." The words struck her dumb. She stared at him, her heart giving a great, painful lurch. Marriage. A husband's name was a shield. A wife was a respectable position. It was a perfect, practical solution to an impossible problem. It would silence Jedediah. It would silence the town. It would make her safe. A week ago, she would have wept with gratitude and accepted without a second thought. But last night had happened. Last night, she had not been a problem to be solved. She had been a woman, wanted and cherished. And she could not bear the thought of losing that, of trading it for a loveless contract made of necessity and pity. Tears welled in her eyes. "No," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. Eli's face fell. He looked genuinely hurt, confused. "It is the only way," he said. "I can protect you, give you my name." "And I would be your wife," she said, her voice shaking. "Another duty, another burden you have taken on because you are a good man. I would be the stray you had to keep, so you put a ring on her finger to make it decent." She pulled her hands from his. "I cannot, Eli, I will not be your charity case. Not after last night." She looked him straight in the eye, her tears spilling over. "I want love, Eli, not rescue." He stood up and turned away, running a hand through his dark hair. He understood what she was saying, but the man in him, the protector, could not see another way. The world had rules, and a lone woman was a target. A wife was not. It was as simple as that. The tender, fragile thing that had grown between them was now caught in the cold, hard gears of the world and its expectations. The sheriff's visit had its intended effect. The invisible wall around Eli's homestead had been breached. The next time they rode into Redemption for supplies, the change was palpable. As they walked down the muddy main street, conversations would lull, doors would close softly. Women would pull their children closer, turning their faces away as if Lorna carried a plague. In the general store, the air was thick with unspoken judgment. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, who had once been friendly, now treated Lorna with a cold, formal politeness that was worse than any insult. She addressed all her questions to Eli, as if Lorna were not even there. Lorna could feel the sideways glances, hear the muttered whispers from the other customers. That is her, the one living out at the Cade place, shameless. She stood by the counter, her back ramrod straight, her face a pale, proud mask, pretending not to hear, but each whisper was a small, sharp stone thrown at her. Eli saw it all, his jaw clenched, his hand never far from his gun. He finished his business quickly, his voice clipped. As they left the store, a man leaning against a post spit a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt near Lorna's feet. Eli's hand shot out and grabbed the man by the front of his shirt, slamming him back against the post.
"You have something to say. You say it to me!"
Eli snarled, his face dark with a rage Lorna had never seen. The man, pale and frightened, shook his head. Eli held him there for another moment, his eyes blazing, before shoving him away in disgust. He took Lorna's arm and led her quickly to the wagon, the eyes of the entire street following them. The ride back to the cabin was silent, the space between them filled with the ugly truth of their situation. Eli could fight one man, but he could not fight a whole town. A few days later, a rider came with a proposition for Eli. A big rancher from down south was putting together a cattle drive to the railhead in Kansas. It was a long, hard job, 3 months at least, but the pay was more than Eli could make in a year on his small ranch. It was an opportunity to build a real future, to buy more land, to have something to offer. He told Lorna about it that evening, his voice carefully neutral, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. It was a chance he needed to take, but the thought of leaving her alone, unprotected, was tearing him apart. She knew, with a sinking heart, what she had to do. The town hated her. Her presence was a threat to Eli's safety and his standing, and now it was standing in the way of his future. "You should go," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I am not leaving you here alone," he said immediately, his tone resolute. "Yes, you are," she insisted, looking up from the shirt she was mending. "Eli, you must take this job. It is a good opportunity. And what about you? What about Jedediah, the town?" "Jedediah will not come back while he thinks the sheriff is watching. And the town, I can handle the town." Even as she said it, she felt a tremor of fear. "I need you to go," she said, her voice softening. "I need time. To think, to decide if this is a fight I can even win. I cannot make that choice with you here, watching over me, trying to protect me. I need to know if I can stand on my own here. I need to know if I want to stay, not just if I am staying because you are here." It was the hardest thing she had ever said. Every instinct screamed for her to beg him to stay, to keep her safe, but a fiercer, newer instinct, one born of pride and a desperate need for her own agency, pushed the words out. She had to prove to him, and to herself, that she was not just a creature to be rescued. He argued, but he saw the resolve in her eyes. He knew she was right. He could not protect her forever from whispers and sideways glances. She had to find her own footing, or they would never have a moment's peace. He finally, reluctantly, agreed. He left 2 days later. At dawn, he packed his saddlebags with a quiet, grim efficiency. At the door, he turned to her. The air was thick with unspoken fears. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace tight and fierce, as if he were trying to memorize the feel of her. "Bolt the door at night," he said, his voice rough against her hair. "Keep the rifle loaded and close. I will be back before the first snow." He kissed her then, a long, deep kiss that was full of worry and promise. And then he was gone, a lone rider heading south, leaving her in the deafening silence of the empty cabin. The first week was a blur of lonely determination. She threw herself into work, cleaning every corner of the cabin, tending the small garden she had started, milking the cow, and mending every last one of Eli's clothes. She was building a fortress of domesticity around herself, trying to hold her fear at bay. But at night, the silence was a physical presence. She would lie in her cot, the loaded rifle on the floor beside her, and listen to every creak of the logs, every rustle of the wind, her heart pounding in her chest. It was on the 10th day after he left that she heard it, the sound of a horse, not moving along the distant trail, but coming directly toward the cabin. Her blood turned to ice. She ran to the window and peered out. It was him, Jedediah. He was riding a big black gelding, and he sat in the saddle with an air of smug, unshakable ownership. Panic seized her. Her first thought was the rifle, but she knew she could not use it. To shoot him would be to prove everything they said about her was true. She would be a murderer, not a victim. There was nowhere to run. The prairie was a wide, open trap. Then she remembered the root cellar. She ran to the thick wooden door set into the floorboards, her hands fumbling with the iron ring. She pulled it open, revealing a dark, square hole and a steep ladder. The smell of damp earth and potatoes rose to meet her. She scrambled down the ladder, pulling the heavy door down over her head. It slammed shut, plunging her into absolute, suffocating darkness. She could hear his footsteps on the porch, then the heavy slam of his fist on the door. "Lorna, I know you are in there. The sheriff told me Cade was gone. It is time for you to stop this foolishness and come home with your family." His voice, muffled by the floorboards above, was a sound of pure menace. She huddled at the bottom of the ladder, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to stifle the sound of her own ragged breathing. She heard him rattling the door handle, then a heavy thud as he put his shoulder to it. The bolt Eli had installed held firm. She heard him curse, his voice a low, vicious rumble. He circled the cabin, his boots heavy on the ground. She heard him at the window, trying to pry it open. "You cannot hide forever. Lorna, you are my responsibility, my property. By the law of God, you belong to me." She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing herself further into the cold, damp earth. The darkness was absolute. It felt like being buried alive. She stayed there, listening to him rage outside, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, after one last furious string of curses, she heard him mount his horse and ride away. She did not move for a long time after the sound of his horse had faded. She just stayed in the dark, shaking uncontrollably. When she finally found the strength to climb the ladder and push open the door, the late afternoon sun that flooded the cabin was so bright, it was blinding. That night, she could not sleep in her own cot. She climbed into Eli's empty bunk, pulling his blankets around her. She buried her face in his pillow, trying to find his scent, some trace of his strength and comfort. But all she found was her own fear. She sobbed into the pillow, a storm of silent, helpless tears. She wept for her own weakness, for the terror that still held her in its grip. She hated herself for hiding, for being a coward. She hated herself for still being afraid. Eli came back 2 weeks later. The cattle boss had broken his leg, and the drive had been postponed until spring. He had ridden for 3 days straight, a sense of unease growing with every mile. He found the cabin door ajar, an overturned stool on the floor. The silence that greeted him was cold and dead. "Lorna," he called, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found her in the doorway of the small bedroom he had started to frame out, a small, broken heap on the floor. She had collapsed there, her face pale and tear-streaked, her body limp with exhaustion and despair. In her clenched fist, she was clutching the 2 pieces of a broken blue hair ribbon. He knelt and gathered her into his arms, his throat tight with a fear and rage so potent it nearly choked him. He carried her to his bunk and laid her down. She did not resist, her body pliant and boneless in his arms. He looked down at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the broken ribbon in her hand. And he knew. He did not need to ask what had happened. He leaned down and kissed her. It was a kiss that was less gentle, more desperate. It was not a kiss of seduction, but of raw, aching possession. A kiss that was a promise and a threat. A promise to her that she was his, and a threat to the world that had tried to break her. She whimpered, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. She did not stop him. She clung to him, her anchor in a world that had tried to drown her. Their second time together was a storm, a fierce, frantic attempt to erase the memory of another man's shadow. It was filled with all the unspoken fears of losing each other, a claiming in the face of a hostile world. The next morning, she woke wrapped in his arms, the early morning light filtering into the room. She felt the steady beat of his heart against her back, the solid weight of his arm around her. She was safe. She had survived. She turned in his arms to face him, her eyes tracing the lines of his sleeping face. He had offered her a rescue, a name, a shield. But she had found something more important in the darkness of the root cellar. She had found the will to endure. She leaned in and whispered softly, her lips brushing against his ear, though she knew he was already stirring. "You do not have to marry me," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet morning. "But I am not leaving." Lorna's declaration, whispered in the quiet dawn, was not an ending but a beginning. It was a line drawn in the dust. She was no longer running from her past. She was standing her ground, ready to face it. When Eli looked at her, he saw not the terrified woman he had pulled from the snow, but a partner, forged in fear and fire, ready to fight alongside him. His path was clear. He would no longer play defense. He would attack. The next morning, he hitched the wagon. He did not ask her to stay behind. They rode into redemption together, side by side, a silent, united front. They bypassed the main street, tying the wagon near the courthouse, a small, clapboard building that served as the seat of law for 100 square miles. The circuit judge, a stern, hawk-nosed man named Solomon Pettigrew, was only in town for 2 days, and his presence was their only chance. Eli left Lorna on the courthouse steps, instructing her to wait. He walked inside, his shoulders squared, his face set like stone. Lorna sat on the worn wooden steps, the weak spring sun on her face, and waited. She could feel the eyes of the town on her, the weight of their judgment, but for the first time, it did not make her want to hide. She met the gaze of a woman across the street, holding it until the woman looked away, flustered. A small victory, but it was hers. Eli was inside for nearly an hour. When he emerged, he was carrying a folded piece of paper. He came and sat beside her on the steps. The tension in his shoulders slightly eased.
"What is it?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It is an official order, signed by Judge Pettigrew," he said, his voice low and steady. "A protection order. It states that you are under my care, on my land, of your own free will. It names Jedediah Stone and warns him to stay away from you and from my property. Any attempt to contact you or harass you will be seen as a violation of a court order." He paused, turning to look at her, his gray eyes serious. "I had to declare your status. You are not a hired hand. You are not a guest anymore." He unfolded the paper so she could see the judge's spidery script. "I told him you were my partner, in the ranch and in my life." Partner. The word settled in her heart, a solid, comforting weight. It was not wife, not a title born of pity or necessity. It was a word of equality, of choice. It was a public declaration that she was not a thing to be kept or hidden, but a woman who stood beside him. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of gratitude so profound she could not speak. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his, her fingers lacing through his. Their small moment of peace was short-lived. As they stood to leave, a group of men emerged from the saloon across the street. There were 5 of them, led by the man Eli had shoved against the post a few weeks earlier. They were emboldened by whiskey and the safety of numbers.
Well, look here,
the man sneered, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear.
"It is Cade and his little stray. I hear you were in with the judge. Cade, trying to make your living arrangement look decent."
Eli put himself between them and Lorna, his body a shield.
"Go home, Abernathy,"
he said, his voice a low warning. "You are drunk." "I am not drunk enough to miss seeing a whore when she is standing in front of me." Abernathy spat, a cruel grin on his face. He took a step forward and spit a thick stream of tobacco juice onto the ground, inches from the hem of Lorna's dress. Something inside Eli snapped. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. He did not draw his gun. He did not need to. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, and his fist, hard as a rock, connected with Abernathy's jaw. The sound was a sickening crack. Abernathy crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the dirt. The other men, shocked into sobriety, took a half-step back. Eli turned on them, his eyes blazing with a cold, lethal fire. "This woman is my partner," he snarled, his voice cutting through the sudden silence of the street. "Her name is Lorna. The next man in this town who shows her disrespect, who speaks her name without honor, will answer to me, and I promise you, I will not be as gentle." He took a step toward them, and they scattered like quail. "Now get him out of my sight." Two of them scurried forward and hastily dragged Abernathy's limp body back toward the saloon. Eli stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. Then he turned to Lorna. He reached out and gently brushed a piece of dust from her sleeve, his touch a stark contrast to the violence he had just unleashed. "Let us go home," he said softly. The ride back was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a battle fought and won. He had not just defended her, he had claimed her, publicly and unequivocally. He had drawn a line around them, a circle of protection that no amount of gossip or spite could penetrate. When they got back to the cabin, Lorna felt the last of her fear fall away, like a heavy cloak she had been carrying for too long. The next day, she did something she had not thought she would ever have the courage to do. While Eli was out mending a fence on the far side of the property, she hitched the small buckboard to the older, gentler of their two horses and drove into town, alone. Her heart was pounding as she tied the horse to the rail in front of the general store. She could feel the stares, but this time, she held her head high. She was not a scandal. She was Lorna, Eli Cade's partner. She walked into the store, her shopping list clutched in her hand. The whispers started immediately, but she ignored them. She walked to the counter where Mrs. Gable stood, her face a mask of disapproval.
I need a sack of flour, please,
Lorna said, her voice clear and steady.
and some sugar and cinnamon.
Mrs. Gable looked as if she might refuse, but something in Lorna's direct gaze, a new and unfamiliar steel, made her turn to get the items. As Lorna waited, a small hand tugged on her skirt. She looked down. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, with wide blue eyes and blonde braids, was standing beside her. It was the Gable's daughter, Anna. The little girl held up a single, bright yellow wildflower. "This is for you," the girl whispered, her voice shy. Lorna's throat tightened. She knelt down.
Thank you, dear,
she said, her voice thick. "It is beautiful." She took the flower. From the corner of her eye, she saw Mrs. Gable watching, her expression a mixture of anger and something else. Shame, perhaps. The woman said nothing as she finished bagging the groceries. Lorna paid, her coins clinking on the counter. As she turned to leave, she smiled at the little girl, who gave her a small, hesitant smile in return. It was a tiny crack in the wall of the town's hostility, a single wildflower of kindness in a field of thorns. That evening, the cabin was filled with the warm, sweet scent of a baking apple pie. It was the first dessert she had ever made for him. When he came in from his chores, tired and streaked with dirt, he stopped, his face breaking into a rare, wide grin. "Smells better in here than I ever thought it could," he said. After they had eaten, while he was enjoying a slice of the pie, she came and stood behind his chair. She leaned down and pressed a soft, deliberate kiss to his lips. It was not a kiss of gratitude or need. It was a kiss of simple, uncomplicated affection. Initiated by her, he turned in his chair, pulling her onto his lap. The kiss deepened, and the pie was forgotten. She was no longer afraid of her desire for him. It felt as natural and as necessary as breathing. In the days that followed, a new purpose took root in her. She had relied on him for protection, but she knew she could not do so forever. She needed her own strength. "Eli," she said one afternoon as they sat on the porch, "I want you to teach me something." "What is that?" he asked, whittling a piece of wood. "I want you to teach me how to ride, properly, not just sit on a horse while it walks. And I want you to teach me how to shoot." He stopped whittling and looked at her. He saw the determination in her eyes and nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "We will start tomorrow." The riding lessons were difficult. Her body was stiff with a lifetime of fear. But Eli was a patient teacher. He showed her how to balance, how to move with the horse, how to feel its rhythm. He would stand in the center of the corral, his voice calm and steady, as she urged the horse into a trot, then a canter, and when she finally galloped across the open prairie, the wind whipping through her hair, a feeling of exhilarating freedom washed over her. She was no longer bound to the ground. She could fly. The shooting lessons were more somber. The rifle was heavy and unwieldy in her hands. The recoil when she first fired it bruised her shoulder and made her ears ring. But she did not give up. Eli taught her how to stand, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. He would stand behind her, his arms coming around her to adjust her grip, his body a warm, solid presence. She could feel his breath on her neck, his quiet voice murmuring instructions in her ear. Under his guidance, she began to hit the targets he had set up. First a tin can, then a piece of wood, her accuracy improving with each shot. She was reclaiming a strength she had buried long ago, the strength of a woman who could not only endure, but defend. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple and black. The rain came down in sheets, and thunder rattled the very logs of the cabin. A brilliant flash of lightning would illuminate the room, followed by a deafening clap that shook the floorboards. They sat on the rug before the fire, watching the storm. The raw, untamed power of the weather outside seemed to mirror the passion that had been building between them. Eli reached for her, and she went into his arms willingly. They made love there, on the rug, with the storm raging around them. This time was different. She was not a passive recipient of his tenderness. She was an active, eager participant. Her hands explored his body, learning the hard planes of his chest, the ropey landscape of the scars on his back. Her lips sought his, her body arching to meet him, in the height of their passion. As the thunder cracked directly overhead, she clung to him, her voice a raw cry against his skin.
Please,
she begged, her voice choked with an emotion so powerful it overwhelmed her.
do not stop.
It was a plea born not of desperation, but of pure, unadulterated want. She was finally, completely free to feel wanted, to claim her own pleasure without shame or fear. The next afternoon, she found him on the porch, his knife in his hand. He was not whittling a stick. He was carving something into the thick pine porch rail. She came to stand beside him and saw what he was carving, in careful, deep letters. Lorna. He did not look up, but he felt her presence. "A place should have a name," he said, his voice soft. "And the people in it." He brushed the wood shavings from the letters and looked up at her, his eyes full of a future she was only just beginning to believe in. "This cabin, it is too small. I want to build you a real house, a kitchen with a big window that looks out on the mountains. Another room, maybe two." He looked at her, his meaning clear. He was not just hiding her in his cabin anymore. He was building her a home, a life. She traced the letters of her name with her finger. The wood smooth and permanent beneath her touch. She had a place. She had a partner. She had a future. For a few perfect, sun-drenched days, it felt like nothing could ever touch them again. The illusion was shattered a week later. A rider approached the cabin, not with the swagger of a drunken townsman, but with the cold confidence of the law. It was Jedediah. But he was not alone, a stoop-shouldered man in a dusty suit. A lawyer from a bigger town rode beside him. Eli met them on the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hands. Lorna standing just inside the doorway. Jedediah did not even look at Eli. His eyes were fixed on Lorna, filled with a triumphant, proprietary gleam. He held up a sheaf of legal papers.
This is all over, Lorna,
he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "There is no need for any more unpleasantness. I have here a legal, binding claim, filed with the territorial court. As Samuel's only living brother and next of kin, all his property reverts to me, according to the law. That includes his homestead, his livestock." He paused, letting his cruel gaze sweep over her. "And his wife." Jedediah's claim, delivered with the smug finality of a death sentence, did not make Lorna flinch. She stood in the doorway, a silent shadow behind Eli, and felt not the cold spike of terror she had expected, but a slow, burning anger. He had used God, the law, and the town against her. He had tried to break her with fear, but he had failed. All he had left were pieces of paper, the last refuge of a coward. Eli did not even glance at the documents. His eyes, flat and hard as river stones, were locked on Jedediah. "Get off my land," he said, his voice a low rumble that was more menacing than any shout. The lawyer, a small, nervous man, cleared his throat. "Mr. Cade, this is a legitimate legal filing. My client is within his rights to claim his brother's property, which, under territorial statute, includes his dependent widow." "She is not a dependent," Eli said, shifting his weight slightly, the rifle in his hands looking less like a tool and more like an extension of his arm. "She is my partner, and this is her home. Now, I will say it one more time. Get off my land before you find out how seriously I take trespassing." Jedediah's face contorted with rage. He opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Eli's eyes, a promise of swift and brutal violence, made him pause. He glared at Lorna, his eyes full of hatred. "This is not over," he spat. "The law is on my side." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, the lawyer scurrying to catch up. They left the papers scattered in the dirt where he had dropped them. Eli watched them go, his body rigid, until they were nothing but a smudge of dust on the horizon. He then bent down, gathered the documents, and without reading them, walked to the fire pit and dropped them onto the embers of the morning's cook fire. They curled, blackened, and turned to ash. "The county seat is a 2-day ride," Eli said, turning to her. "The courthouse there is bigger than the one in Redemption. The judge will be a real judge, not just a man who gets re-elected by keeping the saloons happy. We'll leave in the morning." There was no question of her staying behind. This was her fight as much as his. That night, they moved with a quiet, shared purpose, packing saddlebags with dried beef, hardtack, and blankets. They spoke little, but their movements were a conversation, a silent understanding that they were in this together, to the end. The trail south was rugged, winding through pine-studded hills and across wide, greening valleys. The air was clean and sharp, and the vast, open sky seemed to scrub the taint of Jedediah's visit from their minds. They rode for hours in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the steady plod of the horses' hooves. That night, they made camp in a small meadow protected by a ring of tall aspens. A creek murmured nearby, its water clear and cold. After a simple meal of bacon and beans, they lay back on their bedrolls, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo sky. The fire popped and hissed, a small circle of warmth and light in the immense darkness. Lorna lay on her side, looking at Eli's profile in the firelight. He was watching the flames, his face thoughtful. All her life, she had been defined by men. She had been her father's daughter, then Samuel's wife, then Jedediah's property. Even with Eli, she had begun as a victim, a stray to be rescued. But out here, under the vast, silent watch of the stars, she felt like none of those things. She was just Lorna. "I used to be scared of the dark," she said softly, her voice barely disturbing the quiet. Eli turned his head to look at her. "Most children are." "It was not like that," she explained, searching for the words. "After Samuel died, the dark felt hungry, like it was full of all the things people whispered about me, full of Jedediah. It felt like a place where I was completely alone and anything could happen to me." She paused, looking up at the glittering spray of the Milky Way. "It does not feel that way anymore." He was quiet for a moment, letting her thoughts settle in the space between them. "What does it feel like now?" he asked. She reached out and laid her hand on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her palm. "It feels quiet," she said. "It just feels quiet." She snuggled closer to him, resting her head in the hollow of his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her tight. They lay like that for a long time, listening to the night sounds. "Eli," she whispered into his shirt. "Hmm? I ain't hurt any more." She felt him tense slightly, listening. "I do not mean the scars are gone. I will always have them. But the feeling of being broken inside, of being dirty or ashamed, that is gone." She tilted her head back, trying to see his face in the dim light. "You did that. You made me feel like I was worth something again." Her voice was thick with an emotion that was deeper than gratitude. "So, whatever happens at the courthouse, whatever the judge says, I want you to know that you already saved me." He tightened his grip on her, his thumb gently stroking her arm. He did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was a low, rough murmur against her hair. "You saved me. Lorna, I was just a man living in an empty cabin. You made it a home." The county courthouse was an imposing brick building, the grandest structure they had ever seen. Inside, it smelled of dust, old paper, and stale tobacco. The courtroom was paneled in dark wood, with a high ceiling that seemed to press down on them. Jedediah and his lawyer were already there, sitting at a table, looking smug and confident. They sat at the opposite table, Eli's hand resting on the small of her back, a silent, constant reassurance, when Judge Solomon Pettigrew entered. A tall man with a mane of white hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The room fell silent. The proceedings began. Jedediah's lawyer presented his case, citing laws and statutes, his voice a droning, confident monotone. He painted a picture of a concerned brother-in-law, trying only to care for his brother's unstable, grieving widow, who had fallen under the influence of a solitary, possibly dangerous man. He presented the property claim as a matter of legal inheritance. Then it was Lorna's turn. The bailiff called her name, and every head in the courtroom turned to watch her. Her legs felt like water as she walked to the witness stand. She sat, her hands clutching each other in her lap to keep them from shaking. Eli's lawyer, a young, earnest man they had hired that morning, began his questions. He asked her about her life with Samuel, about Jedediah's behavior after his brother's death. Lorna answered in a low, clear voice. But it was when Jedediah's lawyer stood up to question her that the real trial began. He was cruel, his questions designed to paint her as a liar, an ungrateful woman, a temptress. "Mrs. Stone," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "is it not true that my client, your brother-in-law, offered you the protection of his home and his good name after your husband's passing?"
"He offered to claim me like property,"
Lorna said, her voice trembling slightly. "He offered you marriage, did he not? A respectable position for a widow? And you refused?" "Yes. Why would you refuse such a generous offer? Unless, of course, you already had your sights set on another man. A man like Mr. Cade, perhaps." A murmur went through the courtroom. Lorna could feel her cheeks burning with shame. She glanced at Eli. He was leaning forward, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on her, willing her to be strong. She took a deep breath. "I refused him," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Because he did not want a wife. He wanted a servant. I refused him because he was cruel to me and to his brother. I refused him because the night my home burned to the ground, he put his hands on me, and when I fought him off, he let the fire burn." The lawyer's smug expression faltered. "Those are serious and unsubstantiated allegations. Madam." "They are the truth," she said, looking not at the lawyer, but directly at the judge. She saw a flicker of interest in the old man's eyes. "And what about Mr. Cade?" the lawyer pressed, trying to regain control. "You ran from your family home and ended up in his bed, did you not?" The ugly insinuation hung in the air. This was the moment. She could let the shame silence her, or she could speak the truth, no matter how much it cost her. She thought of the woman in the snow, broken and freezing. She thought of the woman hiding in the root cellar. She was not that woman anymore.
Mr. Cade found me half dead in the snow,
she said, her voice shaking but unwavering. She did not spare them the details of Jedediah's assault, of the fire, of her desperate flight. She spoke of her fear, of her shame, of the way the town had judged her. Her voice cracked, but it never broke. She laid the whole ugly story bare, not for the town, not for the lawyers, but for herself. She was taking her story back. When she finished, the courtroom was utterly silent. Jedediah was beet red. His fists clenched on the table. The judge leaned forward, his elbows on the bench, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth. He looked at Lorna for a long, piercing moment. "Mr. Stone," the judge said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Please stand." Jedediah stood, a look of disbelief on his face. "This court finds your claim on your brother's property to be legally sound. Under normal circumstances," the judge began. Jedediah's face broke into a triumphant smile. "However," the judge continued, his voice hardening, "these are not normal circumstances. This court has heard sworn testimony of assault, intimidation, and willful destruction of property. To grant you ownership of this woman would be to sentence her to a life of servitude and abuse. Therefore, this court dismisses your claim." The smile vanished from Jedediah's face. The judge was not finished. "Furthermore, based on the testimony given here today, I am charging you with attempted coercion and willful endangerment. Bailiff, take this man into custody." It was over. 2 deputies hauled a sputtering, enraged Jedediah from the courtroom. Lorna watched him go and felt nothing but a profound sense of release. She walked down from the witness stand, her legs steady now, and went straight into Eli's waiting arms. He held her tightly, his arm a solid, protective band around her waist, as the courtroom buzzed around them. They returned to the ranch 2 days later, victorious. The land seemed greener, the sky bluer. The cabin, nestled in its small valley, looked like the safest, most beautiful place on earth. That afternoon, Lorna took the few remaining dresses she owned, the drab, worn-out clothes of her former life, and built a small bonfire. She watched as the flames consumed the last vestiges of the woman she had been. When the fire died down, she went inside, took one of Eli's clean flannel shirts from a peg, and put it on. She wore it openly now, with a pair of his old trousers she had tailored to fit her. It was not a disguise or a necessity. It was her uniform, a symbol of who she now was. She was proud, and she was smiling. A week later, Eli found her on the porch in the early morning light. She was sitting in the rocking chair, a bundle of fabric in her lap. It was a simple, sturdy blue calico, the color of a summer sky. She was sewing, her stitches small and neat. He saw the cut of the fabric, the shape it was taking. It was a dress, a simple, beautiful wedding dress. He stood there for a long moment, watching her. She had not asked him. She was not waiting for him to propose again. She was telling him she was ready. She looked up and saw him watching, and a quiet, confident smile touched her lips. He smiled back, a slow, deep smile that reached his eyes. He did not need to say a word. He went to her, knelt down, and took her sewing-pricked hand in his, pressing it to his lips. They married 3 days later, on the ridge behind the cabin, under a tall, ancient pine tree that had watched over this valley for 100 years. There was no preacher, no guests. The only witness was the wind, whispering through the pine needles. Lorna wore her blue dress, and in her hair, she had tucked the yellow wildflower Anna Gable had given her. Eli wore a clean shirt, his dark hair slicked back with water. They did not exchange rings or fancy vows. He simply took her hands in his.
I choose you, Lorna,
he said, his voice solemn and sure.
today, and all the days after. And I choose you, Eli,
she answered, her heart so full it felt like it would burst. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, sweet kiss that sealed their promise, and in the eyes of the mountains, the sky, and each other, they were husband and wife. That night, they lay in his bunk, which was now their bunk. The moonlight streamed through the window, painting silver stripes across the blankets. She snuggled against him, her body fitting perfectly against his, her head tucked under his chin. She tilted her head back and looked up at him, a playful, happy glint in her eyes.
Well, Mr. Cade,
she whispered, her voice full of soft laughter.
Now you will have to keep wanting me every night.
He answered with a kiss, deep and slow and full of a love that needed no more words. The story of their life together began the next morning. It was a story told not in grand events, but in small, quiet moments. It was told in the sight of Lorna, on her knees in the rich soil beside the porch, carefully planting flower seeds, her hands covered in dirt, her face full of hope for the colors of next spring. It was told in the sound of Eli's hammer, ringing through the clear mountain air as he laid the foundation for a second room on the cabin, building a space for the future they had finally, truly earned. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.